Let's commence today's plenary session. As we all know, COVID-19 has wreaked havoc on all parts of society, but most acutely in our communities. The Latino population has been the hardest hit. So today's plenary, Innovation for Early Detection of Global Pandemics and a Coordinated Response System, will tackle that issue and feature the nation's most respected and highly regarded experts in medicine and science. I want to recognize our sponsors for this session: Eli Lilly, Genentech, Gilead Sciences, Merck, and Pharma. Thank you all for your support. And here to share a few words, please welcome Anu Osinusi, Executive Director of Clinical Research at Gilead Sciences. Anu?
My name is Anu Oshinusi, and I'm a physician and researcher at Gilead Sciences. And on behalf of Gilead, we're very pleased to partner with the 2020 CHCI Leadership Conference and to support the work of this organization and the important conversations that are taking place this week as part of this event. Over the past 8 months, my colleagues at Gilead and I have had the privilege of working to advance the company's investigational antiviral for the treatment of COVID-19. At the end of January, I was home on a Saturday night when my phone rang. It was the first request we received to use our investigational medicine to treat a patient with COVID-19. Since then, we have worked around the clock to advance this medicine, to begin clinical trials, to scale up manufacturing, and to provide access to patients in need. As the pandemic has gone on, the scientific community has gained a better understanding of the virus. On a societal level, it has also become increasingly clear that this pandemic and COVID-19 have had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. At Gilead, we are deeply committed to working to end health inequities. Our Compass initiative, started in 2017, is a 10-year, $100 million partnership with community-based organizations working to combat the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the southern United States, a region that is also disproportionately impacted by HIV. Earlier this year, we announced a collaboration with Morehouse School of Medicine to develop a real-time, public-facing, and comprehensive health equity data platform to help address the impact of COVID-19 and other diseases on communities of color. We have also worked hard across our clinical trial program to ensure proportionate representation in COVID-19 and across many other diseases. Representative inclusion in clinical trials remains essential in understanding the effect of investigational treatments, including ours, on all those affected by the pandemic. Events such as today's leadership conference, which brings together thought leaders to discuss critical issues such as COVID-19 and the impact these issues have on the Latinx community, are critical forums for ensuring that innovation reaches all people regardless of their background. I am proud of the work that we are doing here at Gilead to advance our investigational antiviral and to ensure that all of our medicines reach all of the people who need them. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. And now it is my pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend, a Latino leader who has been a member of Congress since 2014, representing the 7th District of Arizona. Congressman Ruben Gallego is the son of Hispanic immigrants, a veteran who served in Iraq with the United States Marine Corps. Congressman Gallego served as an assistant whip for the Democratic Caucus and first vice chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. He is a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. And of course, he is the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Please welcome Congressman Ruben Gallego.
Thank you, Marco. I want to thank all of you for making the time to join us today. Please remember to save the date and plan to join us at our annual 43rd Awards Gala on Monday, September 21st. I want to thank Marco, the CHCI staff, and everyone associated with CHCI for the hard work that has gone into preparing our 2020 Leadership Conference. The first 2 days of the conference have been stimulating and insightful, We've heard from a diverse group of thought leaders and experts representing various sectors addressing some of the most critical issues that impact our community. Thanks to all of our speakers, presenters, partners, and moderators for sharing their time and insights. We are living in a time of great uncertainty. The COVID-19 global pandemic has impacted everyone's life, but communities of color have been affected most acutely. The Latino community in particular has experienced a disproportionate lack of access to both health and financial resources, making it harder to overcome the ravages of the pandemic. But we are a resilient community. As we have done time and time again, we will overcome. We rely on our collective strengths and values to support and lift each other up in our times of diversity. Thankfully, the nation has an incredible set of resources working on our behalf to defeat the coronavirus. And we are fortunate that we are going to hear firsthand the insights of the world's most highly regarded scientists and public health subject matter experts. Among them, I'm especially pleased that Dr. Anthony Fauci will be joining the panel of speakers. Dr. Fauci is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He has advised 6 presidents on HIV/AIDS and many other domestic and global health issues. He led the scientific efforts to combat malaria, Ebola, and Zika. As we navigate COVID-19, the world is relying on Dr. Fauci's expertise to guide us towards a recovery. A pioneer in his field, Dr. Fauci is the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2008 and the National Medal of Science, among others. Before we hear from Dr. Fauci and an esteemed panel of experts in the field of medicine to discuss this timely and important topic, it's my honor to introduce a award-renowned doctor and journalist we have leaned on for the last couple of years and the news. In fact, during this COVID-19 crisis, who will serve as today's moderator. Dr. Sanjay Gupta not only represents the news to us every day, but he's also an award-winning chief medical correspondent for CNN. It's also, among many other things, an academic, a medical practitioner, and an author. Dr. Gupta is an associate professor of neurosurgery at Emory University Hospital and associate chief of neurosurgery at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. He serves as a diplomat of the American Board of Neurosurgery, and in 2019, Dr. Gupta was elected to the National Academy of Medicine, considered one of the highest honors in the medical field. He is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, Chasing Life, Cheating Death, and Monday Mornings. His 4th book, Keep Sharp, Building a Better Brain, will be published in 2021. I hope you enjoyed this session, and don't forget to continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag #CHCIHHM20. And now please welcome Dr. Sanjay Gupta.
Good afternoon, everybody. What an honor to be here, Representative. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be able to help moderate what I think is a very important discussion about something that, as the Representative Gallego said, has been impacting the entire world. We are going to have some updates with regard to this pandemic, but also talk about this disproportionate impact on underrepresented communities here in the United States and in other places around the world. Despite the fact that we're still very much in this, dealing with this current pandemic, there's also the real concern of future pandemics. So we'd like to spend part of our time today talking about some of the lessons that we've learned already, some of the lessons that we still need to learn, and how we can best be prepared going into the future. I think that discussion point, I think, is going to be especially critical as there's no doubt that we may deal with future pandemics. I want to introduce our panel. I'm going to ask them to make some brief remarks. We're going to have a discussion, but we'd also like to hear from you very much. You have a question and answer platform that you can submit questions to. We'll get those questions directly and try and answer as many of them as we can. So let me just quickly introduce our panel, and then we'll get right down to it. Dr. Anthony Fauci really needs no introduction. Everyone knows Dr. Fauci at this point. He is the director of NIAID, as Representative Gallego mentioned. We also have Dr. Melissa Gonzalez as well. She is the Chief Diversity Officer for Genentech. Welcome. We have Michael Ybarra. He's a Vice President of Advocacy and Strategic Alliances and Chief of Medical Affairs for Pharma. Where is he? I think he's here. And we have Daniel Skowronski, who is a Chief Scientific Officer for Eli Lilly. And there was some news today, actually yesterday, regarding Eli Lilly, which we'll certainly ask about. And last but not least, of course, Ruben Mesa. He's a director of the Mays Cancer Center at UT San Diego, MD Anderson. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to the discussion. I think you all have some prepared remarks, so maybe we can get to that first and then just start to have a rather organic discussion. As I said, we're going to be taking some audience questions, but if any of you have questions and you want to engage with the other panelists, feel free to do so. But Dr. Fauci, please, sir, great to see you. Great to hear you. Your voice sounds better, I will point out. But please, sir, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Sanjay. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm just going to make some very brief remarks just to set the stage. As you know, we are really right in the middle of a truly historic pandemic, the likes of which our civilization has not seen in 102 years since the 1918 infamous Spanish flu. Right now, as we speak, there are just short of 7 million reported cases, about 6.5 million cases, and about 195,000 deaths. The discussion that we will be focusing on today really has to do with disparities, particularly among the minority populations, particularly the Latinx population. When you look at the disparities, I think it's important because it hopefully will be lessons learned, not only for what we can do right now, but what we need to look forward to in outbreaks in the future and how we can mitigate against these type of disparities. To just give you an example of something that we will hopefully be discussing in some detail, if you look at the hospitalizations per 100,000 in the current COVID-19 pandemic, it's 331 for Latinx compared to 71 per 100,000 in the white population. That is an extraordinary, unacceptable disparity in health that relates to things that we can right now do something about, but that I think should be a clarion call for us in the future to look at the social determinants of health over decades, which had led to this particular really startling statistic when one thinks in terms of hospitalizations and deaths. And when you look at deaths also per 100,000, 59 in the Latinx population, down to 39 in the white population. So I just want to throw that out as a very brief introduction. I hope we get a chance in the panel discussion. Sanjay, I don't want to be didactic about it now because I want to give others a chance to make brief introductory remarks about the importance of getting the Latinx population involved in the clinical trials, both of therapeutics and in vaccines, because when we get to the goal, which I think we'll reach, of showing that we have more than one vaccine that's safe and effective, we want to be able to definitively say that we have proven in clinical trials that it is safe and effective in the Latinx population and not just make an extrapolation from what we did in a predominantly white population. So let me stop there so I don't take up too much of the time and leave a lot of time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci. Dr. Gonzalez, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I've been with Genentech for over 14 years in a variety of different scientific roles, interacting with research investigators and managed care executives on population health issues. Currently, I sit in the Chief Diversity Office, focused on external partnering and communicating our mission to deliver groundbreaking science to all patients to drive better outcomes by embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I look forward to discussing on the panel today our initiatives called Advancing Inclusive Research, where we are explicitly trying to address the clinical disparities in clinical research and bring more minority patients into clinical trials. And so one of our key features is working with an external council of esteemed advisors. And so I'm happy to say that Dr. Ruben Mesa is here with us today. And we rely on these external advisors to really help us make sure we're collaborating across the field to guide appropriate strategies. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I'm just going to go across the grid here, if you don't mind. Dr. Skavronsky, would you care to make some opening remarks?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Eli Lilly and Company. I'm sitting in front of some of our laboratories where our scientists have been working really since the very early days of this disease to try and create new medicines for patients. We're moving with record speed thanks to collaborations mainly with NIH, with NIAID, with Dr. Fauci's group, who helped us discover a new antibody that we're testing in patients even today, as well as other new medicines. You know, I think we've been focused on diversity in clinical trials, if that's one of the topics we're talking about, for many years now, with a goal of having the population that we enroll in clinical trials closely match the population of the United States. We've made good progress there, and we're proud of that, although there's more work to do. With respect to COVID-19, though, the challenges are even higher. For example, a recent trial that we conducted is in the outpatient population, recently diagnosed individuals, where we're trying to enroll them within days of the first symptoms. In that study, more than 40% of the subjects we enrolled were Hispanic or Latino, which I think is good news from a diversity and representation standpoint, but bad news because it reflects what you heard from Dr. Fauci, the disproportionate burden of disease. So more work to do there. I think also we're working quite hard to make sure not just the patients in our trials represent the diversity of the United States, but also the investigators, the physicians, the clinical advisors, and the staff that run these trials should also match the population. That's a new initiative and even more challenging, unfortunately, than on the patient side. But there too, we're starting to make progress.
Great, Dr. Johnson, thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm the director of the Mays Cancer Center at UT Health San Antonio MD Anderson. And our mission is to decrease the burden of cancer in San Antonio and South Texas. And that's integrally linked with better understanding the care of Hispanic and Latinx patients. Indeed, we are in a Hispanic majority community, where almost 70% of our community of San Antonio and South Texas are individuals of Latinx heritage. We are an NCI designated cancer center, and diversity in our clinical trials has been a main area of focus, accruing over 60% Latinx patients onto our clinical trials, and trying to share those experiences as we all face the COVID-19 crisis together, and experiencing that disparity for Hispanic patients as it relates to this infection. Our institution of UT Health San Antonio has played a leading role in increasing that diversity onto critical studies. So the NIAID study from Dr. Fauci's institute, our center has played an important part, accruing over 150 patients onto the pivotal ACT studies relating to COVID therapy, with over 80% of those being enrolled being Hispanic patients. So I look forward to the conversation. Our clinical trials, for us to truly understand both effectiveness of therapies as well as their safety, clearly need to reflect our populations.
Thank you, Dr. Mesa. And Dr. Ybarra, please, and I should point out as well that you are not only joining us on the panel, but you were actually a participant in one of these trials as well, so we'll certainly ask you about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Thank you for having me. My name is Mike Ybarra. I am Vice President of Pharma. It's an honor to be here this esteemed panel, and I appreciate CHCI inviting me to speak. Pharma is the association based in Washington, D.C. that represents the world's leading innovative biopharmaceutical companies. The members of Pharma are dedicated to researching and developing new treatments for the most vexing problems, the most vexing diseases. And our companies have played a pivotal role in the response to COVID-19 since the beginning of this pandemic, partnering with other life science companies to develop diagnostic tests, making key donations to healthcare providers, whether that's PPE or medical supplies. And then, of course, screening the libraries of medicines for existing treatments that could be active against COVID-19, and developing new treatments and vaccines for the virus. In addition to my work at pharma, I'm also an emergency physician working in Georgetown, just down the road from my office at pharma. And this year I've been working and seeing patients throughout the pandemic. So the way that I think about many of these issues, treatments, vaccines, and therapies, are very much shaped by my experience that I had. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm excited to participate, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Ibarra, and we'll get back to you in a second. You were coming in and out on your microphone, so I don't know if you can adjust that while we can start the panel discussion. Definitely want to hear from you. We're already getting lots of audience questions, and these opening remarks have already generated a lot of discussion. Dr. Fauci, you mentioned this briefly in your remarks, but just to set the table again, what is the current level of Latinx participation in clinical trials now? Is there a way to sort of define that or contextualize that?
Yeah, good question, Sanjay. We don't have right now total transparency in all of the trials, but the ones that we have eyes on, and I can give you an example, that in the vaccine trials that we're going on right now, we're doing much better with Latinx than we are with African American, and we're putting a lot of effort on trying to equalize the African American. So if you look at the percent of the population that's Hispanic, a while ago it was about 16.7%. It's gone up now to almost 18%, or around 60 million people in the United States. If you look at the percentage of what we're seeing in the vaccine trial, it's somewhere around 15.5 to 16%. So it's almost as much, not quite, maybe a percentage point or a percentage point and a half less than what the general population is, which is pretty good. But the thing I think we need to do, Sanjay, I think we need to do even better than that, because it should not only be what the reflection of the people in the population, but a reflection of what the percent of disease is and hospitalizations. So I think we're doing pretty well at almost 16%, but I'd like to see it a bit above that to reflect the fact that we have, when I gave you the hospitalization numbers, there clearly was a disparity. So we really need to do a little bit more there. So we're doing okay, but we need to do a little better.
Dr. Mesa, this is, I think, a fundamental point, and I just want to make sure we understand this. You talked about recruitment within some of your own trials, admittedly for oncology trials, but some of the same basic concepts here. As Dr. Fauci was saying, percentage of the population or incidence of disease within that population, in terms of what you're trying to achieve with trials. What do you strive for with some of the trials that you've conducted, Dr. Mesa?
Well, it's an excellent question. First we try to match the distribution in the population in terms of what percentage are Latinx kind of within the population. But the second point you raise is key. How does that really match with both the incidence of the disease as well as factoring in issues such as age? Compared to what population for a particular disease, whether it's COVID or breast cancer, how does that best match the individuals at risk?
Dr. Gonzalez, I just wonder, we spoke a little bit, obviously, last week in preparation for this panel, just in terms of overall recruitment for these types of trials. What are the real barriers here? I mean, people talk about lack of trust in some of these trials, questions saying it's not even clear how people would get involved with the trial. I mean, just nuts to bolts. Like, how do you even do this? Is there significant enough outreach to these communities that we're discussing or not? Just wondering if you have any insights.
So we need to show up in the communities. We need to go to the Latino people and engage with them with culturally relevant information, have the dialogue and listen to them about their fears, about the distrust, and help explain with clinical research. What do we do with their data? Who sees it? Who has access to it? What that data is actually used for? I think we also need to embrace shared decision making. With Latinos, it starts with familia. So we want our family to be part of the decision if we're going to participate in clinical research. Thus, we need to train doctors, clinical research staff to make sure they are asking Latinos to participate, because they might just be assuming and not asking them, that they're communicating the value and making sure the family is involved and helping communicate that information as well. And we want to make sure that we're partnering with community clinics, with physicians, to really hear what they think resonates with patients so that we can then develop the right information to help engage them with healthcare.
I think that this panel probably certainly understands the value of the Latinx community participating in these clinical trials. But for the audience at large, Dr. Gonzalez, how do you make the case? What is the value, the specific value of the participation?
So a lot of times I think patients don't realize that standard of care is expected of doctors. Cutting edge treatments are often available in clinical trials, and they just hear the word experiment or trial, but we need to change that dialogue and help them understand this is the groundbreaking medicine that will lead to personalized medicine, not only for people today, but for the future. And we need to make sure that this groundbreaking medicine is available to all of us, especially because we are a growing segment of the population. We want to be confident that treatments being developed today are going to treat future generations of Latinos as well.
Dr. Skowronski, we talk a lot about the vaccine trials, obviously, but I know there's been some news from Eli Lilly about monoclonal antibodies, and I want to talk about that in a second, but just wondering if you want to react at all to the discussion thus far in terms of recruitment of trials for therapeutics as well.
Yeah, we have some experience in this area. You know, our experience actually started when in early March, we set up a free diagnostic testing facility, a drive-through testing facility in our corporate headquarters for people in the community who needed diagnostic testing because it wasn't available. And we started looking at the demographics of the patients that we got coming in to get tested. And despite knowing how the disease was affecting African-American communities and Hispanic communities, mostly they weren't represented even coming to get tested at our facility. And so we took a look and said, why is this? And it had to do with how we communicated about the availability of testing, the way that you signed up for it with a computer, the requirement for a car to come in and drive, the sort of intimidation factor of coming to the corporate headquarters. And so we shifted tactics early on to meet patients where they are and working with the state, set up diagnostic testing facilities at churches and community centers and in more diverse neighborhoods so that we could help a more diverse group of patients. So then when we started doing our clinical trial with a therapeutic, looking at people who are recently diagnosed, we did the same thing. So instead of going to exclusively the big academic centers and expecting the patients to come to us to get diagnosed and treated, we set up a community-based trial. So we went to the diagnostic testing facilities, the drive-throughs or the walk-up tents out in the community and tried to build a trial infrastructure around that so we could meet the patients where they were. By and large, that's worked, and we've gotten a much more diverse population, I think, than probably others have been able to accomplish through that technique. It also goes to who you hire or who you partner with as investigators, who you, what channels you use to communicate and how you communicate. Another example I have is a trial we're doing in nursing homes. So it's a completely different paradigm now, where we're going out to nursing homes to try and treat patients before they have the virus. So as soon as the nursing home has a case, they call us. We show up literally in vans and RVs, a team of scientists, to ask people if they want to participate in research. The first few times we deployed to nursing homes, although the nursing homes were relatively diverse, we noticed we weren't getting a diverse population. So we asked the people, why did you choose not to participate? And we heard no one talking about the study looked like me. And that was important feedback. And so we changed that. It's important to have investigators and study personnel that represent the diversity of the trial population. And we started making changes there, and that started to have positive benefits. But it's a conscious effort, and it's deliberate. It has to be from the beginning of the trial. And there has to be learning cycles where you try something, and if it works, you double down, and if it doesn't, you move on.
Thank you. That's great. And we'll come back to, again, more specifics. Dr. Ybarra, you are a participant in one of these trials, the vaccine trial. I believe it's a Moderna trial. I think you've shared that, but that's the blinded trial, so you don't know, again, what you received exactly. I'm just wondering, how's it going? How did you get involved in this?
Yeah, hopefully my sound is better now. Hopefully you can hear me. I
Yes.
have several Zoom classrooms going on, so bandwidth is a little tight here at our house. It really was important to me to kind of walk the walk in this regard, working both in the street and I really wanted to take the opportunity to participate. And what I did was I actually signed up at the NIH website, the coronavirus prevention website, put my information in, and I was outreached to by a study coordinator at a site that was running the Moderna clinical trial. I received my first injection about 3 weeks ago, and I'm going back for my second injection next week. And one of the things that really stood out, I agree with everything that Dr. Jones and Sanjay said about things that need to happen. But one thing that kind of jumped out to me is just how personal of an experience this is. This is a healthcare interaction, just like anything else. You're sitting across the table from an investigator. You're the volunteer, and so much about how you feel about the trial is about that personal interaction that you have. So I really think I agree with everything that's been said about the infrastructure that we need to put into place to communicate with volunteers and participants in trials. Because I think as a healthcare practitioner, there's a lot that I kind of knew or talk myself through. But you need to have study coordinators that are able to communicate effectively with volunteers. And so as you said, I don't know if I received vaccine or placebo. That would be a part of the process. I did participate in the nucleic acid trial, so it's an mRNA vaccine. But there are a number of vaccines that are in late phase clinical trials now. And I think from an industry perspective, we're just excited that there are kind of multiple shots on goal. We need a lot of approaches being studied with the hope that we will have a successful vaccine candidate as soon and as safely as possible.
Great. That sounded a lot better. Thank you. Maybe close out some of the other things. This conference is to improve your audio even a little more. Thank you. I'm just curious. We've talked about this before, and we understand, as you point out in your opening remarks, the disproportionate impact this pandemic has had. You talked about all the various reasons, likelihood of exposure, people more likely to get sick at work, unmasking, the structural inequities that existed long before the pandemic. But I just want to make sure I understand, from a biological perspective, are we talking about potential genetic or epigenetic factors that need to be addressed in this? In terms, again, of really trying to get the diversity that reflects the disease into the trial, is that one of the biological sort of underpinnings of what you're talking about?
Sanjay, it could possibly be, epigenetic and biologic, but I think there are things that are more easily explainable. If you look at, for example, the incidence of getting infected versus being free of infection, and look at the types of employment and jobs that as a group, as a demographic group, Latinx have, it puts them much more in contact in a person-to-person way with the online frontline jobs, manual jobs in which they're interacting and don't have the capability of doing what we're doing right now, of essentially doing something in a protected environment of a Zoom. They are out there, they're in the trenches, they're interacting, and if you look at the rate of infection, it's higher. I don't think that has anything to do with epigenetics or anything like that, even though I'm not ruling out, Sanjay, that that's a possibility. But then when you look at the hospitalizations and the deaths, you then look at the kind of social determinants of health, the things that lead to a greater incidence of diabetes, a greater incidence of obesity, a greater incidence of hypertension. Those are things that likely relate to circumstances in which they find themselves in that may have a genetic component, but more likely are due to the availability of the kinds of diets that would be healthy diets. We see that both with the African American population and we see that with the Latinx population. So I refer to it as an unfortunate double whammy. In the first place, they are positioned through no fault of their own to be more vulnerable to actually acquiring the infection. Once they get it, when you look at availability to health care, availability to testing, availability to easy access to being cared for, then you get into the situation of why they have more hospitalizations. So I think when we study it enough, which we will, there may be some genetic components, but to be honest with you, Sanjay, I doubt seriously if that's going to be the major determining factor. It's going to be more circumstances, socially and others, that put them at more risk.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and I want to have Dr. Gonzalez weigh in on this as well. I guess I don't I want to make sure that I'm addressing this fully, but just from a vaccine standpoint, this idea of giving a vaccine that is then going to induce an antibody response that hopefully will be protective to the person the next time they get exposed to the virus. In terms of the diversity of trials, leaving aside the socioeconomic factors, is there any reason to believe that the vaccine would not work in a particular population based on their demographic? Well, I understand that they may be more at risk for all the reasons you mentioned, but there's vaccines that are being trialed in China and in Russia. Would those vaccines, would they be anticipated to work in places all over the world? Dr. Fauci, and then I'll have Dr. Gonzalez.
Yeah, absolutely not. I think that's an excellent question, Sanjay. We have no reason to believe that a vaccine that we prove to be safe and effective, and even if you did it in an all-white population, that or a non-Hispanic white population, that it's going to be any different. But the critical issue is that when you try to get people involved in the clinical trials, you want to be able to say definitively when the vaccine becomes approved that we have definitively shown that it is equally as effective and safe in this population versus that population. And unless you can say that, there always will be the lingering doubt. Well, you haven't proven that it's safe in me, or you haven't proven that it's effective in me. So that's really the reason why the percentage of people you get into the clinical trial is directly related to your capability of convincing people, once you show a vaccine is safe and effective, of actually taking it. What would really be a tragedy, Sanjay, is if we show that a vaccine is safe and effective and we don't get participation in the actual vaccination program of minorities, including Latinx, that they are going to again be deprived of the protection. So I told you about the double whammy of more likely to get infected, more likely to have a serious consequence. It would be terrible and shameful if the third whammy would be now you don't want to take the vaccine because you're not convinced it works.
That's great. That really explains it well. Safe, effective, and trusted. It seems are the criteria. Dr. Gonzalez, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to add anything to that?
I just totally agree. It's a confidence issue. And I think when you show people that you're willing to invest in them, have the dialogue with them, you can enroll minorities into clinical trials. We're on the treatment side, but we just recently fully enrolled a clinical trial for the treatment of patients that developed COVID-19 induced pneumonia. And we purposely recruited in areas where there were underserved minority populations. So if you have the right conversations, show them that you are there to help and give them confidence, they will enroll. We were able to enroll over 85% minorities, with the majority of those being Hispanic patients.
If any of you have points to make, you want to just quick raise a finger. I'm keeping an eye on everybody. But Dr. Mesa, I was going to go to you next, but go ahead and then I'll ask you my question.
Yes, well, I would certainly concur. I think that confidence is crucial. You know, we have seen that there is great enthusiasm for participation both in cancer clinical trials, but in the COVID clinical trials as well. I think as long as they are well explained and they're felt to be part of the process, you know, the Latinx community, you know, very much wants to be active and participate in these studies. Another key part during this era of that confidence is a confidence that it is safe to show up for healthcare. So that's the other piece that we really have worked on, is again to give them confidence that the environment, the screening getting into the environment, that there's social distancing, masking, PPE use, etc., so that it is safe for them to go in to receive their healthcare.
And we talked about this briefly last week, Dr. Mesa, but I'm just curious, specifically telemedicine. How much has that changed your practice over the past several months? And what about with the Latinx community in particular?
Well, telemedicine, I think, has really been a significant benefit of the impact of the pandemic in being able to reach out to patients at a great distance. And it's had an impact both in our cancer patients and in terms of COVID. So in terms of COVID, individuals with potential symptoms who are potential candidates for getting tested or screened were able to interact with our primary care physicians and therefore kind of keep the clinical environments more socially distanced, be able to more appropriately manage and arrange for that testing and have those individuals involved. Actually, it's allowed us to be a resource for a big geographically diverse area. We are the academic medical center for San Antonio and South Texas. And South Texas is roughly the size of Pennsylvania, with cities such as Laredo or cities along the Rio Grande Valley, you know, even being 6 hours by car. So we're able to, again, identify whether people might benefit from coming in for face-to-face care, triage in terms of symptoms. If it's cancer patients, we can do consultations, assess for toxicities, deliver medicines remotely. So it's had an impact both in terms of our cancer practice, but clearly in terms of COVID as well. I've had individuals with cancer that have developed COVID that are more remote, and we're able to consult in terms of additional questions. Should they be placed on anticoagulant therapy to prevent risk of blood clots if they develop COVID? How they are recovering. It can bring in multiple specialists from perhaps diverse areas to consult on those cases that are more geographically distinct. So telemedicine is something that my colleagues and I certainly hope will remain an active resource even after the pandemic is over.
Yeah, I got to say, it's been pretty remarkable. I've always been surprised that telemedicine hadn't taken off more before this pandemic. At our institution, Emory, the first 2 months of the year, there were 80 telemedicine visits total in the hospital system. By the end of May, there were 80,000. Just looked at this data, and I think it's, you know, like you, I think it's something that's probably, hopefully, here to stay. Dr. Skowronski, I just in case we lose you at some point, I want to make sure we get to some of the news around the Eli Lilly antibodies. There was news about this tomorrow. Yesterday, and I think there's some more coming out tomorrow. We heard a fair amount about convalescent plasma a few weeks ago when there was an emergency use authorization that was submitted for this. I think it was on a Sunday, 3 weeks ago now. Wondering if you can just give us sort of the lay of the land. Where do things stand? There's been a lot of promise, a lot of discussion around antibody therapy. Where do we stand, and what has Eli Lilly done recently?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I was going to make a comment about telemedicine real quick, and,
go ahead.
Then I'll answer about the antibodies.
Okay.
But there's nothing good about COVID-19, but if there's a silver lining, it could be that. Because we were running clinical trials all over the world when this hit, we were forced really to run our trials differently, to do telemedicine and do visits that way, to send drug directly to the patient instead of making them come into the clinic. That's going to unlock our ability to enroll much more diverse patients. I think it removes one of the barriers here. So I'm excited about that. So with respect to antibodies, there's a lot of reasons to believe that neutralizing antibodies could work. There's a history here in other diseases. Typically, in viral infections, when neutralizing antibodies work, it's early in the disease course. It's either in prevention before a person actually gets infected or soon after. Neutralizing antibodies against COVID-19 bind the spike and prevent it from infecting cells. That works in the lab, so we can stop it on human cell cultures. That's good news. It works in primates. We and other companies have shown in non-human primate models of disease, we can stop infection from becoming a disease in these animals. That's really good news. And then there's all of these lines of evidence from humans. So there's the data on people who have antibodies that they've made themselves because they've been exposed to the disease, and now they're not susceptible to reinfection. And then there's the convalescent plasma data, which isn't a controlled trial, but if there's something in convalescent plasma, it's likely to be antibodies from other patients. And so, based on all of this data, I think there's been a lot of enthusiasm in the field for lab engineered and produced antibodies that can mimic what your own natural antibodies do. But because we can make them in a factory, we can make huge quantities for an individual patient and give it to them in early stage of disease. And that's what we're trying to do. The data that we announced even just early this morning is early. It's just the first glimmer, but it's exciting. It's from a phase 2 trial on patients who are recently diagnosed, who were dosed with our antibody, one of our antibodies that we manufacture in a factory. And what we saw is an early signal that shows it can reduce the amount of virus in their body, as measured by a nasopharyngeal swab. It can lessen their symptoms to some degree. But what was really striking is it could keep people out of the hospital. The hospitalization rate in this study was much lower for people who were randomized to drug versus placebo. That's exciting. I think we don't fully understand it, and we're working with NIH and others to understand the data. But I think there's a signal here that tells us that in some people, they don't clear the virus well enough. And we have to find out who those people are. And those are the ones that can benefit from a drug like this, an antibody treatment. So more work to do, but we're excited to have this first glimmer, I think, of hope for antibody treatments.
Dr. Fauci, it's always struck me when I was reading some studies about, just as Dr. Swaronski was saying, the amount of virus you have in your nose, your mouth. Obviously, you'd like to correlate that with the likelihood of dispersion. But when I look at these studies, unlike the flu pandemic of 1918 or even H1N1, the dispersion of this particular virus seems pretty low. In fact, according to the JAMA study back a couple of months ago, I think roughly 10% of people are accounting for 80% of the infections. Even within household contacts, 30-40% of the time, household contacts are not getting infected. I think it might have even been higher in some other studies. And yet there's obviously other stories about a single infected person going into a crowded setting, as you've talked about so many times, a bar or somewhere where people can't wear masks, and all of a sudden dozens of people become infected. Do we have any more insight into why that is? This is a contagious virus. Why is the dispersion so variable, do you think?
Yeah. We don't really fully understand that, Sanjay. The one thing that we do know is that it is, even though when you look at some of the family studies, there's not, you would expect everybody in the family, it must be the circumstances of the contact, because this is a highly transmissible virus. And we know that when, we used to talk about super spreaders, but there really are more super spreader events than there are super spreaders as an individual person. And we know that from things like choirs and family functions and weddings where you come in and all of a sudden you have a high degree of transmissibility. Prison populations when people are confined. I think that in direct answer to your question, we don't understand fully that. But the one thing that we really should not lose sight of, that this is a highly transmissible virus. Very clearly, we're seeing that just from the pattern of what we've seen. But all of the details of the variability of that is still not completely understood.
Yeah, and I remember you telling me as well that, again, as Dr. Skronsky was just mentioning, that some people become very ill with this, obviously, as we know. Some people are totally fine, and some people, can become very ill and need oxygen, maybe even need things like ECMO. And sometimes it's clear from some of the risk factors, but other times it's still not really clear at all, especially in younger people.
Yeah, well, Sanjay, the thing that has puzzled me when we began to fully appreciate the scope of the clinical spectrum, and to this day continues to puzzle me as much, is that of all the viral diseases that I've had to deal with over the last few decades of emerging infections, I've never seen anything with a range that goes from 40 to 45% of the people have no symptoms at all, to the range of people who have mild, maybe a day or two feeling poorly, those who are in bed for weeks at a time, and now we're starting to see a post-viral clearance syndrome, what people are referring to as the long haulers, who wind up having symptomatology for weeks at a time and maybe months, to those who require hospitalization, to those who require intensive care, intubation, ventilation, and death. It's just completely unique to see that degree of variability of a single microbe, which means there are things that are determining that we still at this point don't understand. Whether that's the range of expression of ACE2 receptors, it isn't just whether you have an underlying disease or not. It's just not the case. It's something more than that we still don't understand. And that's one of the things that creates confusion in society of why often we can't get young people to appreciate the seriousness of this, because it turns out that most of the time, not all the time by any means, that a person can get infected and have absolutely no symptoms. So how do you convince them that it is really important that you don't get infected? Because if you do, you could probably and likely be spreading the infection inadvertently. And yet one of the things we're dealing with in this country is a real lack of understanding of the importance of everybody trying to prevent getting infected, rather than inadvertently and in some cases innocently propagating the outbreak and infecting someone who you had no intention at all of infecting.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point, and I really hope that people are hearing you. I know you've been saying this for some time, and I want to get to Dr. Ybarra here in a second, but just one thing I want to clarify. I think I represented your remarks well yesterday or the day before when you said a universal mask mandate may not be in the cards, and I think what you were suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the will of the people,
Right,
as well as the legislative authority, have to sort of be in agreement on this. They have to be in lockstep. It's tough to legislate good behavior.
right. I watched your program on CNN,
Oh,
and you
good.
represented me absolutely accurately. You said
Okay.
what I think that Dr. Fauci meant is not that he doesn't want people to wear masks. He wants everybody to wear masks, but to mandate it would almost have a reflective pushback on people. And as you said correctly, how do you enforce that? So you represented it perfectly correctly, Sanjay.
Well, I still, I come back to this point, and I know it's not the focus of this particular panel, but, I'm an internal optimist, and I have always, covering wars and natural disasters around the world, I have, people always say it must be really tough, and I say you see the best in people in those situations as well. You see people who were quiet, people who suddenly rise up and become leaders, and you really see the best of people in these situations. I've believed in this idea of reciprocal altruism, that it actually feels good to do something good for somebody else. It feels good for the giver. And I don't think I'll ever understand in the midst of all this how we could say you could be part of a movement that could save 120,000 lives as things stand now by putting on a mask when you go outside, and yet people would say, "I'd rather not. It ain't for me." It's not a question. You don't need to respond, but I just, there's so many mysteries that we may solve, and medical innovation may move at such a rapid pace, and yet there are some deeper mysteries that I'm not sure I will ever fully understand. But Dr. Ybarra, I'm curious, from your perspective now as with pharma, the collaboration that must need to take place between organizations like pharma, the federal government, other countries, how does that work in the midst of a pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is clearly an incredibly unprecedented time, as everyone has really well explained, and that calls for unprecedented collaboration as well, both with industry among companies, but then also with companies and governments, companies with academia. And so I think the key thing is that I heard a CEO of a major pharmaceutical company said, we're not in competition with each other. We're in competition, a race to find a treatment or a vaccine against this virus. And so if one company reaches it sooner, that's better for society, of course. And so I think that's the main thing. Where competitors were once competitors, now it's about beating the virus, collaborating on clinical trials, sharing data. Another major aspect of the collaboration among companies is pooling manufacturing resources. How can we work together to have adequate supply chains, adequate supply of vaccine and therapeutics when they're able to come to market? So all those aspects are really important from the industry side of things. But then it's also really key that we work really. Yeah, please. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, it's also really important that we work closely with governments, whether that's domestically here with the NIH, and there are some examples where companies provided medicines to NIAID, to NIH, to run clinical trials early in the course of the pandemic, working closely with regulatory authorities, of course, as well, to make sure that we're synced up and we're designing clinical trials that will meet the standard. And then also collaborating with, BARDA, for example, the Biomedical Advanced Research Association, so that we have the supplies that we need. We have the supply of vaccine and therapeutics to meet the demand of the population. So the collaboration really extends within companies and then with companies and governments, both domestically and internationally.
And some of these issues that you're raising, Dr. Ybarra, are ongoing issues. I mean, we talked about the supply chain around testing, and I think the audience at large got a good education about the various supply chain pressures and the things that worked and didn't work. We may need 600 million syringes, for example, for this vaccine, 2 doses, if it turns out to be. Are those conversations ongoing? And is the approach, look, we need to insulate our own supply chain here in the United States so we can be more autonomous, or is this to have better agreements with other governments and countries around the world?
Well, I think it's important to understand that these supply chains were not created overnight. These are supply chains that were designed over many, many years, many decades, and it's important that we, any policy that we're thinking about really takes into account kind of the complex nature of the supply chain, and also the fact that there's global demand for all of these things. So one, I think, positive is that many manufacturers, innovative manufacturers, are already starting the process of manufacturing at risk. So vaccine makers have already taken the risk, begun to manufacture vaccines before they even know if they're going to work. Some of these medicines are very complicated to make, and I think that just speaks to the speed at which industry is really tackling these problems. We're manufacturing at risk. We're thinking through these issues kind of long term so that we can be ready as soon as a therapeutic or a vaccine is proven to be safe and effective.
I'm going to transition to preparation for the, I guess, inevitable, maybe the right word, future pandemics. Well, I want to talk about that in a minute. But I do want to stay on this vaccine question for a second. And Dr. Mesa, I'm curious just with trials overall, and then I'd like to open this up a little bit. But if you're conducting a few different trials using different therapeutics, either in your world of cancer, hematology, whatever it may be, and one of them does seem to work, has efficacy signal, and at that point, you basically remove the placebo group. You're giving everyone the therapeutic. What happens to the other trials at that point? Do they continue on with their placebo-controlled trial, or would it be unethical to continue those other trials at that point? Does that make sense?
It does. You know, it's a very dynamic situation, and sometimes we do have that situation in cancer. You know, if one therapy really appears to be a breakthrough, how does it impact the others? We do know that trials sometimes vary a little bit regarding the exact group of patients that are going to be treated. Are they all exactly treating the exact same group? Do we have enough confidence in the data from that first study to be certain? You know, what you raise is really a major concern. You know, concern I would have, and not that I'm a vaccine expert, but that if one of the trials was prematurely deemed to be the winner, it could potentially poison the recruitment to the other trials. And then if we find that that lead trial really was not as good as we hoped it would be because of either safety or effectiveness, we have poisoned the other trials that could have given us the answer and derail really the whole solution. So I think there does need to be some caution in terms of really shutting down parallel studies unless if we really, really are 100% certain as to the outcome with the first one. I suspect as well, you know, we've talked about diversity on this panel. And again, we may find that even if that lead drug is really effective, it likely is not that effective in 100% of individuals. So it will still be important for us to have alternative backups. We may find subgroups that are more responsive because of either genetic factors, environmental factors, comorbidities, decreased kidney or liver function. So be reluctant to shelve other studies because of those issues.
And
One thing I agree
Dr.
completely with, I agree completely with what Ruben said. But one of the other things you could do, depending on the circumstance, is if you have parallel studies going on and one shows what looks like a pretty good effect, and you've asked the question, what do you do with the other studies? You could have the intervention that appeared to work in one study and make that the placebo in the other studies so that you then do a non-inferiority study. You convert it to say, is the one you're looking at now, namely intervention number 2, as good as or better than intervention number 1, so that you get away from the ethical considerations of keeping a placebo going when you know one intervention works. It doesn't happen all the time that you can do that, but we do that sometimes when we get an effective therapy.
That's interesting.
We
And
have I was going to say that's a very special sort of intervention. We would need a Dr. Fauci to call upon to occur.
he's pretty busy. I don't know. Dr. Skronsky, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that as well.
No, I mean, this is always a problem. And when we think about, you know, we call it equipoise in our clinical trials. Is a drug so good that it's no longer ethical to give placebo? It's a particular challenge, you know, in this era of emergency use authorizations. We have to make sure that as different treatments get authorized, there are still ways to conduct clinical trials because that's the point of that regulatory pathway. So speaking now of therapeutics, you can imagine sort of narrow populations, those that could benefit the most going first. You may not have equipoise any longer in that population, but then confirmatory trials could be on an adjacent, larger population that maybe is less high risk and less is known. It's important, though. I think we don't want to be in a situation where small trials and results and our desire to make drugs available to patients as quickly as possible then closes the door for the full research that needs to be done to fully understand these medicines. So it's a topic that all of us, I think, in the industry are tackling really on a daily basis to make sure that we do this in the right way. I'm optimistic that it will happen right. There may be exceptions to the contrary, but in general, I don't expect those to come from industry. I think we have our eyes open to this.
before we get to Michael Ybarra to talk about some of the planning and lessons learned from this pandemic so far, can you give us any updates, Dr. Fauci, on where the trial stands now? My understanding is that the Data Monitoring Safety Board, DMSB, will look at the data that's emerging first. And if there are efficacy signals, then they will pass on that data to the FDA. But it's pretty independent up until that point. Have you seen data? Do other people see data?
Oh no, the data are blinded. The only people who now see the data, first of all, they're all double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, Sanjay. So intermittently at predetermined points, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board look at it. They look at it. There's a model that tells you when you should have reached a certain number of infections. So the modeling of the statistics indicate that you need about 150 to 152 infections to be able to make a determination of efficacy that's at least 50% with a 30% outer boundary. Now, with that as the statistical setup, when you reach a certain number of infections, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board look at it. They're the only ones that can then determine what the placebo group is and what the treatment group is. And then they'd be able to determine whether or not there's an efficacy signal. At that point, they then turn it over to the regulatory authorities, and the company makes a decision whether they want to submit to the FDA either an emergency use authorization, which is not the official approval, or what's called a BLA, which is a biological license application to get a full approval. So right now, the trials are over 2/3 enrolled and really close to full enrollment on one and almost full enrollment on the other. But remember, these are a prime boost, Sanjay, which means that even though you're fully enrolled, that everybody needs to get dose number 1 and then 28 days later, dose number 2. So even though you're fully enrolled, you don't have everybody that has gotten both doses.
And I just did some quick math. So if you're looking for 150 roughly people in the placebo group who have the infection right now.
No. Total, Sanjay.
Total. So about 100.
150.
So 100 roughly in the placebo group and maybe 50 or whatever in the vaccinated
You don't
group.
know.
You don't know.
That's a great. Yeah, it's a great point you make, and that's the beauty of blinded placebo-controlled trials. So the modeling says that when you get 150 some odd infections, you're going to know one of two things. A, that they're equally or almost equally divided, that it's ineffective, or they're divided enough that you're going to say it's effective. And then how effective is going to depend on how many more were in the placebo versus the treatment.
That's it's a really good way of explaining, and I think it's really beneficial for the audience. I did some quick math just for sake of this conversation to get to 100 people who have been infected in the placebo group right now. If the placebo group, let's say, is 10,000 people, which it may be a little larger than that, but let's just say it is. We're getting about 1 per 10,000 right now infected every day in this country. So it would take roughly 3 months roughly to start to accrue that number of infections. Is that a reasonable timetable?
Yeah, it's reasonable when you look at the total country homogeneously. But if you happen to have a site that is in a place where there's a lot of infections going on, you could get that answer more quickly than 3 months, Sanjay, which is a really great point, because there's this discussion that you yourself have been involved with discussing on your program, that some people say, well, we'll get the answer in November or December, i.e. me. I still maintain that likely. And others are saying, well, maybe it's going to be in October. And it really depends on where the sites are and how many infections there are in a site. So you could get your answer sooner, or you can get your answer a bit later. The reason I make the projection of November is because in the calculations of where these sites are, I think it's going to take that long. But I might be wrong, Sanjay. It might be earlier than November and December. I would still put my money on November, December.
Okay, well, I won't hold you to it, but I appreciate that insight. I do want to come back to you in a few minutes and talk about the safety aspect of it. When is enough time sort of lapsed to say that at least for the immediate adverse effects, we feel comfortable? We'll get to that in a second because there's a lot of questions coming in from the audience. And Dr. Gonzalez, a lot of these are coming in for you, these initial ones. So let me start with this one. It says health disparities point to too many factors, including access and cultural competence. If we haven't yet bridged that gap, why would we trust an accelerated trial for COVID-19?
So, I think a lot of it is about education. What really resonated with me when Dr. Ybarra was talking earlier about the collaboration with safety supply chains, et cetera, we need to apply that same type of collaboration when it comes to health equity issues. If one company invests in health equity, it's one company. If there's a lot of us working on it, that's how we start to move the needle. And that's when people really start to see a difference. It's not just about knowing that one company has resources, it's that multiple people now realize the importance of these resources for Latino patients.
I mean, it's a fair point, though, a fair question. I mean, we're obviously dealing with an unprecedented event right now, and there's obviously a lot of understandable optimism around the vaccine, but you can't just erase a lot of these structural inequalities that have existed for so long, right? I mean, education is important. All the things that you've talked about is important, but I think it's a fair point. This listener is asking.
Yeah, and I think it's multifactorial. It's not just education. It's investing in having, as we've talked about, supporting more Latino students going to medical school so that they can talk to medical doctors that look like them. It's about supporting education programs from kindergarten all the way through career. So it's not just about one clinical trial patient. It's about investing in the whole community along the entire journey.
Dr. Mesa?
Yes, I was going to add that there fortunately has been momentum moving toward greater equity in the clinical trial process that preceded the onset of the COVID pandemic. So there really has been a tremendous energy and effort from the FDA and in particular our colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, both as individual companies, but really working together to really look at these issues, whether it be African Americans, whether it be Latinx, whether it be Native Americans or other groups. And again, trying to dissect the issues of health disparities versus genetics versus culture. So at least there was some momentum and kind of pre-existing collaboration prior to this, the pandemic hitting, that I think will be able to make greater strides more rapidly because of that pre-work that had been done.
I'm just going to go through some of these questions. They're a little bit unrelated, but let me ask this one to Dr. Skowronski. It's for you specifically. What can policymakers in the drug industry do to help avoid the next pandemic? And maybe how much are you thinking about this? I mean, are you so in it right now that it's all about your monoclonal antibody, or do you have time to think about this question?
Both. We're working on our monoclonal antibody 100% of the time, but we're also thinking about the future. I think there's a sense that we as a country and as a pharmaceutical industry, we're not adequately prepared. We've been working as fast as we can, and I'm really proud of the progress. Next time we need to do better, and I think we will. We and other pharmaceutical companies are discussing this. So my peers, the R&D leaders from each of the big pharma companies have been meeting on a regular basis since the start of the pandemic. Initially how to respond acutely, but now the discussion has turned to preparation for the future. And how do we increase the level of investment from pharma, the level of collaboration with NIH, so that we can react even faster next time. bring our resources to bear. There's a number of reasons why we're not, fully why we weren't fully invested in this area. Of course, economic reasons are probably at the top of the list. It's hard to create a business of investing to prepare for a pandemic that is hard to predict and may never come. But I think by working together with government and working together across industry, we probably easily solve that problem. Now, in the face of a pandemic, nobody cares about economic incentives. We all just want to help. We should feel the same way about the next pandemic. That this is COVID-19, but there'll be others, COVID-25 or whatever. And we need to invest.
Dr.
Can I
Ybarra?
jump in here? Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add on, and I totally agree with everything that was just said. One area that, and I know Lily's been a leader in this space as well, is thinking about antimicrobial resistance as kind of the next big threat that is really kind of right in front of us. When I think about treating patients with COVID-19, organically, antibiotic resistance is something that is a factor in the current pandemic. So it's kind of something we're very aware of right now. Biopharma companies have come together to launch the AMR Action Fund, which is a multi-billion-dollar commitment to fund the development of new antibiotics. We think that right now the arsenal of antibiotics is concerningly low because of resistance that currently exists, and the incentives are not in place to develop new antibiotics for a variety of reasons. So the AMR Action Fund is all about investing in new antibiotics, and then I think there's work to be done to create incentives so that we can bring new antibiotics to market. There's a variety of challenges that currently exist. Number one, the one that I see most often is when I'm working clinically, the newest antibiotics are often reserved, held back. We don't want to use the newest, latest, and greatest. We want to kind of save it for that moment that we know definitively it's a severe kind of antibiotic or a multi-drug resistant infection. So there's a variety of factors at play. It's something that we're definitely committed to because it's kind of a crisis that we can see coming down the pike very shortly.
It's interesting, Dr. Ybarra, as a doctor, just trying to get people to do the right thing in terms of eating right and exercising and doing all that. It's a tough argument to make sometimes. You do all these good things and then nothing will happen to you. It's not the most inspiring argument, right? But trying to prevent or to anticipate problems and investing in it is challenging. So, Dr. Skowronski made this point. You're making this point. So what is the lesson learned here? How do you get people to think of this more like a defense sort of thing and invest in the defense of the country or the world in this case?
Yeah. Well, I think a key component of it is kind of recognizing how this can impact anyone. And sometimes you talk about diseases in a way that it feels like I might be immune to it. It gets to the point Dr. Fauci made, which is that young and healthy people think that they may not be impacted by COVID-19, that they might get an asymptomatic case or a mild case. And as everyone on this panel can attest, myself included, I've seen young people come in incredibly ill with COVID-19. And the same can be said for things like antimicrobial resistance. There's a number of prime examples, very public examples, NFL players who have had serious infections as a result of multi-drug resistant superinfection. So it's something that I think we need to do, much like diversity in clinical trials, speak to communities, give examples that really resonate with them. I think the same thing can be said for these pandemic preparedness kind of plans that need to be put in place.
Go ahead.
Yeah. If I continue on that theme, I mean, you can just see all of the different bottlenecks in this process. Just to pick one, it's the manufacturing supply chains, which are robust for existing drugs. We and everyone who's involved in making medicines has built factories to make the medicines or the supplies that go into making medicines that are function close to their capacity. It's not smart or profitable to have a lot of unused factories, so they don't exist. And yet, when you have a new disease and suddenly you're talking about hundreds of millions or billions of doses, all of those factories that exist are busy, and you can't build a new one. That's the kind of investment that has to be done when there's not a pandemic, years in advance. And since we don't really know who's going to need it and what exactly we're going to need, it needs to be done collectively under the supervision probably of governance and even governments and even global health authorities working together with companies to put that infrastructure in place so we're ready to surge production of new treatments when the next disease comes.
Dr. Gonzalez, there's another question that's come in here. I wonder if you want to tackle this. Once a vaccine is approved or authorized, will there be equal access to low and moderate income communities or those who depend on the public health system or have no insurance? I don't know if is that a question you want to tackle? I mean, I don't know if there's an answer to that yet.
Yeah, I don't think there is an answer. And I mean, we're on the treatment side, and we certainly realize that there are cost concerns and access concerns. I mean, we need to all, again, talk to policymakers, work together, talk to other companies to collaborate and figure out when there are barriers to access, when there are barriers to affording out-of-pocket costs to getting to the doctor, transportation issues, childcare. How do we make sure, as you know, Dr. Fauci said, that we're reaching everybody? They've already had a double whammy. We need to make sure we're helping them also get access to available treatments, medicines, and vaccines.
Can I jump in on the vaccine?
Please.
Thank you. I think that, there's been a variety of work done by the federal government to ensure an adequate supply of vaccine in the U.S. Through Operation Warp Speed. And, there have been some positive steps that Congress has taken as well. The CARES Act included provisions that, for example, Medicare beneficiaries, the vaccine would be covered under Medicare Part B at no co-payments. So I think it's a great question because we clearly need to think about all of the barriers that might exist to a patient or an individual's maybe foregoing a vaccine, and we definitely do not want cost to be one of those barriers. And I can say in other kind of examples in other infectious diseases, vaccination, affordability has typically not been a barrier to patients getting access. So it's something we're very aware of, something that we are happy to continue working on. But Congress has taken some steps to ease that, particularly for Medicare beneficiaries.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a problem with the cost because I think people don't fully appreciate the vaccine itself has already been bought by the federal government. So a person who gets a vaccine will not pay for the vaccine. And the only cost there would be is costs associated with the administrative components of administering it. And it's interesting, today, what came out of HHS was the plan for the distribution of vaccines. And there's a statement in there that no one is going to be denied a vaccine because of lack of ability to pay for it. So I think that's something that's going to be very important when we think in terms of availability of vaccines.
But we have to make sure we're going into the communities to meet them there. So for instance, with some of the clinical trials, I was searching around for a clinical trial in my local area, and they only wanted to offer appointments Monday through Friday. Well, for somebody that's on the, as you mentioned before, in the trenches working, has childcare issues, they need help. They need, transportation assistance or more flexible schedules to access this healthcare.
Yeah,
you're absolutely correct.
Yep.
The practicality of it. We're going to transition to closing statements in just a minute. There's so many questions still that are coming in. But I did promise that I just wanted to talk about the safety of the vaccine quickly as well. Dr. Fauci explained the efficacy signals that we may look for and even gave us some time frame on that. When we looked through the FDA database, and Operation Warp Speed shared some of this, they say most adverse effects from a vaccine occur within the first 42 days to 2 months time frame. Does that seem like a reasonable amount of time to wait then after the full dose, after both doses,
Yes.
both shots in the arm?
The answer is yes, and that's one of the reasons why when you look at the FDA's guidelines about when they approve or give an EUA, that in addition to an evaluation of the efficacy signal, there's a mandated wait for X period of time from the last dose to make sure that you're not dealing with an unanticipated safety signal. That it is true that the overwhelming majority occur within that period of time, but there are also post-licensure phase 4 studies that look later on to make sure there aren't late effects that you would have missed. So the multiple month lag period is something that the FDA is very well aware of.
For authorization, obviously
Right,
initially, and then
exactly.
approval ultimately. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I think maybe Dr. Mesa, I think it's time to move into some final thoughts. I don't know if you wanted to start off, Dr. Mesa. Just any final thoughts or a closing statement.
You bet. Well, first, this has been really a spectacular discussion, and I think it highlights that diversity is really one of the great strengths of the United States. In cancer, we clearly have learned that by studying diversity, studying the impacts both pre-diagnosis that lead to individuals developing disease, as well as how they respond to therapy, and then our survivors, has helped us in the war on cancer. Clearly focusing on all the drivers and importance of diversity as it relates to the defeat of this pandemic and future ones, similarly very crucial. We celebrate our diversity.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I have to say, you come into a lot of these discussions sometimes with a lot of knowledge, as panelists or even, me as a moderator prep a lot. But I've learned a lot today, just sort of listening to this discussion, because there's a nuance to this that I think is really critical and sometimes gets lost in the very rapid news cycle. Dr. Skowronski, do you want to go next? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I just say that I continue to feel optimistic about the future. Probably, both in respect to this pandemic, I think we're starting to see advances come from this cooperation between the biopharmaceutical industry and the U.S. government through NIH and other governments around the world that will yield meaningful drugs, therapies, and vaccines. That's good. I also feel optimistic about the future because we're learning new ways to work through COVID-19 that I think will pay off in more diverse clinical trials in the future and more rapid clinical trials, and more preparedness for pandemics. So we'll come out of this as a healthcare system and pharmaceutical industry stronger than we went in, and more optimistic about the future.
Yeah, and I hope the memory, stays, because there's sometimes we have short-term memories for some of these things, and I think there's some lessons here that I hope we never forget. Dr. Gonzalez.
It's on us as scientists to continue reaching out and building trust with the Latino community, help educating them, and starting with our families, having the conversations, because we know that's how it perpetuates. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your insights. Dr. Ybarra?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, share the insights of industry as a clinical trial participant myself, and also as an emergency physician. And maybe I can just end by kind of reiterating what I was hopefully getting across at the beginning when I was having sound issues, which is just that the industry is completely committed to doing everything that we can to end the pandemic, whether that's donations of PPE, medical equipment to critical frontline providers, investigating new medicines, checking the library of existing medicines and developing new vaccines, doing so at unprecedented speed, but not skipping any steps, taking all the precautions so that we can say that there's safe, effective therapeutics and vaccines. So again, thank you, and look forward to working on all the critical issues related to health equity and diversity in clinical trials, because it's something that certainly the industry is committed to, and also something that pharma, the trade association, can kind of work with our membership, including those on the panel, to advance. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ybarra. Quick yes/no question for you. Would you consider being part of a challenge trial?
I think that as a frontline healthcare worker working in the emergency department, I think that's one of the reasons that I was selected to enroll, because I've been around COVID-19 patients every week, working clinically for the last, 8 months, and perhaps longer based on the UCLA study that was just published last night. So,
Right.
It's not a challenge study, but, I am taking care of patients every week, and, thankfully haven't to feel safe. But I have had colleagues that have been infected, early on in the pandemic, before we were as, careful and cautious with all of the precautions that were being taken. We certainly had colleagues that got sick. I'm thankful now that I feel safe when I go to work. I have an amazing team of folks that have made sure that we've put precautions in place. But I think we absolutely have to keep that up as we head into the fall and winter.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Fauci, I just wonder if you have any closing thoughts or statement.
Yeah, just very quickly, Sanjay, thank you for moderating this panel. One of the things that we always talk about when we go through challenges such as this are lessons learned, and there certainly will be many lessons learned. But lessons learned are only important if you have corporate memory to remember what those lessons should be. And I think one of the things we absolutely cannot forget is that this outbreak, this historic pandemic, has shed a very bright light on health disparities in a very, very significant way. So when we get through this, which we will, this will end, we will get a vaccine, we will be over it. Let us not forget the health disparities and the causes of the health disparities, which have led to the extraordinary difference, as I've shown and mentioned, between the burden of disease in the minority, including Latinx community, compared to the rest of the population. So that's a major lesson learned that I hope we don't forget.
When do I get to see you in person, have dinner with you and Christine, and buy you dinner? You say we're going to get through this. When will that happen, do you think?
It's going to be well into 2021, Sanjay.
Right. I can wait. I'll wait for it.
I'll buy.
No, I think you deserve to have me buy anyone else. Thank you all for your service and your time today. Learned a lot. I hope the audience got a lot out of this as well. And I want to welcome back Marco Davis for some closing remarks. Thank you.